Hey,
Bethany, how are you doing today?
what's up? I'm doing well. How are
I'm
you?
doing fine, Bethany. I loved your talk with Michelle. That was just magnificent. I really enjoyed that very much.
It was so fun. We could have gone on for 2 more hours.
Excellent.
It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Excellent. No, I love the point. Javier, good to see you as well, my friend. Good to see you. And I'm going to be at you had a wonderful Substack recording just yesterday that I really enjoyed. But Bethany, the point you made about the idea of how when you call something art, that kind of pulls it out. It makes it more difficult to integrate into daily life. I thought that was magnificent. Do you see that tension kind of going on in your line of work?
Yeah, all the time now, especially since moving back to New Mexico because there's a lot of there's a huge connection to indigenous craft work
Mm,
here. And it's sort of weird in the name of like being inclusive and being divert, like this whole diversity and inclusion thing. In the name of that, a lot of museum curators are trying to incorporate a lot more indigenous um, artwork, or they will commission indigenous artists and say like, I want your weavings to be your textiles to be displayed, or like, I don't know, there's a lot of museum workers who are like curating this kind of art into the institution, whereas like a lot of people who grew up in Pueblo community are like, well, like they feel that tension where they're like, okay, I guess this is art, like I'm just finding out now that this is art because it's a Western lens. And but really it's like a way to connect to our like mythology and spirituality. Like I had a recent conversation, or I had a recent interview published with a curator at this gallery in Albuquerque, and she is Dine, and she grew up in Western New Mexico. And she was like, I was raised by my grandmother who was a weaver, a lifelong weaver. And she was like, but it wasn't art to me. Like that's our philosophy and our way of life. And so, yeah, I feel it a lot right now. Um, just like a sort of, it's definitely like a Western thing. And I think that this like institution of art has this like umbrella term for, I don't know. Yeah, yeah.
This is so fascinating. And I think it actually ties into some of the things we've been discussing because usually the notion of calling something art is a kind of honoring and a kind of protecting and saying, oh, this
Right.
is not merely another thing. There is something about this that suggests a kind of higher focus, higher level of skill. And yet, what's so
Yeah.
interesting is that precisely in that act of honoring, there's a kind of risk that you can kind of
Yeah.
alienate it from its daily life. And what's also interesting about it is there's a kind of way in which, if the weaving is art as not art, but as daily life, it almost could arguably be more beautiful because it's integrated into the
Right.
very fabric of daily life. And what I find very interesting, that Michelle and I talk about a lot, is this tension where actually art is a threat to beauty. You know, we tend to think that art honors beauty, but then it actually can kind of be a
Mm-hmm.
threat to beauty because it removes the object from the kind of integration with everyday life in which the art is dance. You know, there's kind of a way in which when it's in your
Yeah.
daily life, it's dance without being dance. I find this very interesting as well. We got 1 million views. We have a cat. Yes, thank you, Bethany. I appreciate it. Javier, get your cat. I don't have a cat. I'm the only one here that doesn't have a cat. I am in the no cat club. Oh, frick. But it's
Aw.
interesting because it almost thinks about the difference between art as icon and art as idol, where if art is an icon pointing to beauty, that's good. But if it becomes an idol where you're just looking at the art, then it can almost threaten beauty. And yet, the whole reason one creates an idol in theological terms is to get at the divine. And yet, that could be precisely why you don't
Mhm.
get at the divine. And it's interesting to think of that. And
Right.
because it also, and Javier, feel free to respond to this because I thought your Substack was really good on this. It makes me think of the problem of philosophy, where the moment we say, oh, that's an interesting or philosophical topic, it pulls it out of the everydayness in which we're living with that depth, and in a way then has it alienate from that depth. So we've been talking a lot about this kind of apathetic subject, the fact that the human being, like what is human, is something that's here and yet it's not here. And it's kind of funny because the moment you ask the question, what is the human being? it's almost like Nietzsche's centipede, where you're frozen up and it's more difficult to kind of operate. And so there's a way in which philosophy seems to have a similar tension here, where the moment something is looked at as a philosophical subject, it can pull it out of the flow of living that, the kind of dance of the everydayness. And yet the whole reason somebody brings something up as being a philosophical topic is often precisely to more deeply examine it, perhaps to protect it, to perhaps better understand it. So the whole reason, we call something tends to be to honor it. So that suggests the need of kind of thinking about, these are always giant titles, a new way to think about art, a new way to think about philosophy. So it's interesting to think of those, and I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. It's interesting to think of those kind of overlaying.
It's funny what, just real quickly, you said art as icon and then art as idol. And I knew what you meant. For a split second, though, I thought of idol, IDLE. And I was like, oh my God, that's like a like this like crazy, because then I was thinking about like, if art is idle, if philosophy is idle as in still, then it can't be woven into everyday life. It can't be a part of the whole like choreography.
Oh, nice. Oh, dude, I'm gonna do like art philosophy is idle with the E in parentheses. That's so good, because then it's like still. And we actually talked in the net about the shark. Remember when the shark stops swimming, it dies. So like the rest of the shark has to be found in the swimming. So likewise, the art has to be found in the moving. The philosophy has to be found in the beauty. Nice, Bethany. I've got it right here on my notepad. I got idle with the E. That's really good.
Well, Daniel.
Hello, Javier. How you
doing? Okay, so jumping in on art. All right. Yeah, I think your point on art as idol, art as con. I mean, I think the media difference I heard from even like Bethany too is that art has the risk of losing that everydayness, right? And it almost seems like that everydayness is more important than our kind of like looking at whatever that is, and that does seem to be the cost of like raising some type of awareness for diversity. And I think this makes me go back to like even Buber's like everything becomes like an I-it relation eventually, right? Like everything. But to bring up like abstraction and concrete, right? We associate everyday life typically as something more concrete. Now, I don't know, Daniel, but I've been telling Michelle about how I've been struggling in my English class because my English teacher very nicely said, I like your paper, but bring it back to the concrete, you know? And so she gave a couple examples in class, and I thought it was actually philosophically very interesting because she goes, you saying, for example, that you are happy or sad or something very general, that's abstract. She's like, you need something very descriptive. And so I think, ironically, with art, that's kind of what happens, right? You have this picture, painting, dance, whatever the case it may be, and it's just like, all you get, right, when you watch this is, oh, this made the Indians happy. Like, this made them connect to something, but you're not getting the actual relation. You're still missing the actual relation, which means that the art itself just becomes like an idol, basically. Just that's it. And I think, and Bethany is right? Like these things that we use as art, and this is where like religion and art really starts, intertwining, right? Mythologies, everything. Like art and religion combined, that was like everyday life, right? That's what it was, right? Like, the Muslims doing their Islamic art, it's incorporated with the Quranic verses, written on the mosque walls. Like this is what they did. And the same thing with what else? The geometrical shapes, right? This sort of like these geometrical shapes have like a sort of divinity to them, not just shapes, right? So how do you have that relation? We just look at it as shapes. We're like, oh, that's really sophisticated, but we're still missing the point. And the same thing with when, Buddhism got to Japan, like, scholarship is arguing over, Buddhism as object or, so on. But anyways, what gets fascinating is that if you were to tell all these people chanting sutras and doing ecstatic dances and what else? I had a specific, oh, like making Buddhas and temples. You're gonna say, oh yeah, that's just art. For them, it wasn't art. You know, it was actually like a way of life. It's a way of living, you know. They're trying to save the state by, you know, praying to the Buddha and so on. So I think there is that discrepancy going on when we just say like it's just art, you know.
And I guess you could say that this is sort of like along the same parallel to, or sort of like the same as like the overlapping of art and religion, but like also art and philosophy are feel very like intertwined. And I think about this curator that I interviewed a few weeks ago, like how she was saying like weaving was a philosophy. Like she specifically said those words. And I think that that is also super interesting just in this conversation of like reifying philosophy and reifying art as well. And another interesting thing is that this theme shows up in the tarot quite a lot in the minor arcana. In a lot of those cards, you see mountains depicted. This is mostly in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which is much more like cartooned and like each card is supposed to be like a narrative. The whole tarot is kind of like a graphic novel in the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot, as opposed to older versions. But anyway, mountains signify like philosophy, and going up to like in the major arcana, the Hermit card, number 9, is a hermit solo traveling up a mountain, summiting and like being at the peak of the mountain and being like the hermit has done all of the like has made the philosophical journey and has like reached enlightenment or whatever. But then in the minor arcana, you see the mountains again, and they symbolize this like philosophical or spiritual journey. And in a couple cards, you'll see the mountains really way off in the distance, and like what's foregrounded in the card's narrative, this is like the 9 of Pentacles specifically, or the 10 of Pentacles. You see like it's in both a little bit. You see a family and just like people enjoying their lives, and it's supposed to mean, those cards specifically mean the enjoyment of everyday life, having like philosophy there in the background kind of. And so it separates this, and I think that that is like like that was a huge part of that deck, came out in 1909, and it was a huge part of this like new, like it preceded the New Age by a few decades, but it was a huge part of the New Age thought. And so like there's also this play on like this thing going on where people think that there's like has to be a separation between mundane life, ordinary life, and philosophy. And I just think that it's interesting, like a rhizomatic network connection with like tarot as being a part of spirituality, being part of religion, and having this like visual narrative separating everyday life and philosophy, wisdom.
I think that's a magnificent association, Bethany. And it is interesting to me because there seems to be this long tension of this notion that we need philosophy as background. Dimitri, good to see you, sir. Always a pleasure to see you, Dimitri. Thank you for being here, sir. And no, Bethany, that's really good. I've been thinking a lot about, you know, there's this, there's often people who will say that one of the reasons the sciences have been in trouble is because they've made hard categorical distinctions between, say, physics, biology, chemistry, and all these different things. And that's like where the problem of consciousness really emerges, or you lose sight of it, is when you make those hard distinctions. But when you see that it's more like a gradient, then you can start to kind of approach certain problems and questions in different ways. And the guy who was, I've had like 3 people send me the video, Mr. Luber, Mr. Ad, on Lex Friedman, this biologist I need to watch, apparently, who just did something on Tufts. It was apparently really good, and I need to watch it. But I did get far enough where he was saying that. It also seems something similar applies to the humanities, where the moment we separate philosophy, the arts, social sciences, economics, then we get a lot of problems. Whereas if we understand they're kind of part of the same gradient, that can really help. It makes me think too, if I were to say, oh, are the mountains part of the territory or the field or the farm? It's kind of a silly question because the landscape kind of turns into mountains, and then it turns into farms, and it turns into field. It's all the same thing, and yet there is distinction. So likewise, it's almost like with the sciences, it's like, oh, we're dealing with biology. Well, now it's going to, you know, you're dealing with raw physics, then it turns into chemistry, and then the mountains, and that gets into kind of the vector theory that Mr. Bard and along the different people will talk about. So it seems like philosophy, art, all these things are part of a similar territory that changes, but it all kind of runs together in different ways. And it also makes me think of how, so right there's this notion that you can't have hard distinctions between these things. But then Mr. Ebert, say in the Hegel anthology, talks about how in mathematics today there's an argument that there's no equal sign, only equivalence. So nothing technically equals, it's only equivalent. And how there's a lot of mathematicians that actually want to get rid of the equal sign. I found this was really fascinating. I read a number of papers about it. So this is really interesting. Because it would suggest that reality is something that we shouldn't draw distinctions in, or at least hard distinctions. They should be temporary categories. And yet there's no equality. There's only equivalence. So you have this thing that runs together that has only equivalence. So it's not identical, which means that that would provide reason to think you should create distinctions, like hard distinctions, precisely because there's no equal sign. And yet it's not, so there's a way in which the mountain doesn't equal the field, and yet it is like the field, right? There's some sort of similarity because it's composed of, soil and rocks and different things, but there's only equivalence. This makes me think too of the analogy of being that you'd have in Thomism, this notion that we can only be like God, you can't be equal to God. There seems to be a theological similarity to that as a construct, and things like that. And but with that, I'll give it to Mr. Javier.
Well, I'm really glad you brought it up, Daniel. The distinctions, because what is it? Me and Michelle, we found an article. I'm pretty sure she's been telling you about it, right? Between Hegel's dialectic and Nishida's dialectic. But this is still something I'm trying to wrap my head around. But just to kind of give some context, when I was hanging out with Barnes like last week, right? He was telling me like how crazy like Kant's like stuff is, because he's like, when you actually think about it, Kant is really trying to say that space is extending out from the subject, basically, because it's like a mind thing, right? But Nishida apparently saying actually it's the subject that is projecting onto space, right? So there's like this almost like chicken or egg argument going on, right? But nonetheless, right, whether we look at Kant or Nishida, what's hard to pin down is the subject. And what I get when I hear like when we want to make these like hard categories is that I really feel like there's an anxiety of the subject going on, where it's like everybody is so adamant about having this objective, clear-cut boundaries. But the crazy thing is, the more you investigate that boundary, the less clear it is, right? It's like, I really like, was it Thich Nhat Hanh talks about like when you look at a tree, right? And the tree in itself carries all of existence, right? The air, it has like everything included within that tree. Like you cannot just say that the tree is just this bark or whatever, right? Because it depends on the soil, the sun, the air. It depends on so many things. So it's like the moment you start saying like, okay, this is tree, this is not tree, like really? Because if it didn't have this, it wouldn't be this, would it? Yeah. So just to say like your, shark example, right? It wouldn't be just that it stopped swimming, that wouldn't be a shark anymore. Basically, if it didn't eat, if it didn't like have anything else, if it didn't have an ocean, like if it just wouldn't be anything, right? So it's so contingent on so many things that if you were to say this is what it is, I feel like we're still missing a part of that picture. So I really liked when Bethany said, the quote, like weaving is a philosophy. But I think this is where we really get the idea of like, actually, there is weaving going on. That if you were to snip anywhere, that's not the thing. So I do like Nishida's idea that when we think about the subject, think of it like an infinite sphere, where anywhere you try to pinpoint, you can't pin it down. And then at the same time, the center is everywhere, right? So that's how ambiguous we have the subject. And that's why I'm still happy to say that the subject is apophatic, right? It's apophatic in itself. I guess the real question is this obsession with distinctions. I mean, I don't think this helps us when it like comes to like actual relations, with human beings. And I talked about this in my own talk on the Substack, just to bring it up now, Daniel, where I was like, we have this tendency to meet categories, right? We want like a girlfriend, a boyfriend, but it's like this obsession with a category, or avoiding a category, and so on. It's, again, we're all trying to make clear distinctions between what that is. And I remember, just to kind of this, I'm kind of ranting on at this point, but I remember a girl one time. She was telling me how she kissed a dude, and she said that that dude thought that she liked him, right? And she goes, in my mind, kissing doesn't mean that I like you. I just wanted to kiss you. You know what I mean? Like, so she, for her, like the relation between, or the division between like friend and like interested party is, it's not very clear to her, right? She admitted this, right? But at the same time, I actually think this is an adequate point, right? Because the assumption is, if somebody does kiss you, that there is a parent interest. But that may not necessarily be the case, right? So that's the assumption. But anyways.
Yeah, I cannot turn on my camera. I don't know why. But I think you know who's talking, so that's what matters. Yeah, this is super interesting, and surprisingly so, I'm gonna bring Hegel into this. Because in the lectures on logic, Hegel talks about time. And he says things like thinking is higher than space and time, cause and effect are higher than time. And a lot of times, usually in these circles, you hear it a lot that Hegel is a process thinker, he's a philosopher of time, of development, of becoming, especially becoming. But I don't think it ends there. And after becoming in the science of logic, you get determinate being. So what is this? Well, I'm not going to give you an answer, but there is something after becoming that's, I think, important to take into account. So Zizek, in the book The Ticklish Subject, proposes that since subjectivity is excessive, maybe there's a fourth moment after all. And actually, Hegel does talk about a fourth moment in a footnote in the Science of Logic. And he says, it's something like this, yes. I don't know, maybe there's a fourth moment after all. So how does this work? Well, first of all, Javier, I agree with what you said, that the subject is apophatic in itself. Or another way to say this is the subject is negation. Now, if in the lectures on logic, Hegel talks about, imagine a house is being flooded, right? First you see the water, and then you see the house being toppled by the water. So this is a succession of moments. But he says, actually, cause and effect you don't sense this, you don't perceive this. These are logical concepts that my words is like that you extract from those senses and those perceptions. So you have cause A and then effect B. Now there must be something that connects and divides them. Hegel calls the connecting of it a judgment, and a division, he just calls it division. Funnily so, in German, these terms look a lot like each other. You have Urteilen and Einteilen. But okay, in Buddhism, there's an understanding of the inseparability between cause and effect. There's what is a cause? Well, it's always preceded by an effect. What's an effect? Well, it's always preceded by a cause. But then we get stuck with the two poles, right? Like we just go at either end of the spectrum. But still, you miss a grounding of the two, because this is being done by a third. And this third is, of course, the negative subject, which you could say is also the capital C cause of the causal chain as such. And what's super interesting here is that Immanuel Kant actually knew that he couldn't ground freedom in the noumenon. He tried to do it, but then he became aware that, okay, look, in this causal chain, we just end up with an antinomy. So there also must be kind of like a third, which Kant also was aware of, that it is the subject. So anyway, the four moments of the dialectic are as such. You have abstraction, then you have immediate negation, then you have negation for itself or self-related negativity, and then you get the concretion. I mean, this is hugely speculative, but I mean, it's provocative, so it's fun to think about, especially since everyone loves thinking in triads these days,
That's very well put, Dimitri. And I salute you for your dedication to be taking on so much of Hegel so continually for so long. I salute you, my friend. Well done. Mr. Samuel Barnes, good to see you. The United States of America lost half its value as soon as you returned to Europe. So we're all recovering from the collapse of our mortgages and our bank accounts. So it's good to see you, Mr. Barnes. And everyone should get the Iconoclast. A few different things. It's interesting. I was speaking with Dr. Philippe Nicholas, who has a class coming up actually on the phenomenology of spirit on the 16th. And we were kind of talking about how what's interesting in Hegel is that you need categories to think. And yet the moment you use categories, you're kind of destined to fail. And actually, it's really important that you think the thought until the point it fails, which makes me think something that Javier said once about like thinking a thinker until they prove incomplete. And you're not thinking Buber enough, or you're not thinking Heidegger enough, and you really think them through. And so Hegel seems to have a structure where it's almost, for me, I would think of it as tragic, where you can only think a thought. You only think a thought that you think to the point that it fails. And actually, a lot of problems that we have in the world is people don't think thoughts to the point of failure. And this kind of makes sense because if no map is the territory, then the only map that actually unveils fully that it's not the territory is the completed map. If you don't complete the map entirely, then there's still space for kind of plausible deniability that it won't be the territory, right? So likewise, it's really important to think through entirely to then find out that thought in its very structure has a kind of failure that's integrated into it. But what's important is for Hegel is the point of failure is the doorway to the next thought, or to say the next step in the phenomenological journey, as Dr. Last talks about it. So it's really important in Hegel that a failure is an invitation. Like when you fail at something, it invites you into more things. It's not where you discover that, say, thinking ultimately in its very nature must fail, and therefore you kind of curl up in a ball and cry and pet your cat. But actually you say, oh, this is an invitation. So precisely when you realize, oh, wait, categories can be problematic, that is a thought that requires you to actually think category to realize. But when you do that, then you start saying, oh, well, maybe the line between art and philosophy and the humanities in general is not so strong. Maybe there are connections. Oh, maybe physics, biology, chemistry, and these different things are not so separated. In fact, maybe a lot of our confusion is thinking to separate them. And you see, once you kind of get that failure is invitation, well, then you're kind of incentivized to think the thought to the failure. What ends up happening, though, is there's actually a big problem in that when we reach a point of, it seems to be human nature that when we reach a point where thinking unveils itself as failing, we deny that it fails. And that's when we become pathological. We deny that we saw that, and then we become very adamant about our field of philosophy, or very adamant about our field of physics as having nothing to do with the other sciences, or being very adamant that we as self-relating are not negativities. No, we actually do self-relate. We don't want to get to the point where it's unveiled that it's a self-relating negativity. So then we become pathological. And one of the things that I think Hegel does is precisely give one an intellectual schema in which they will expect failure, but also know that that failure is going to be a doorway to the next step. A few things. Bethany brought out how in Wittgenstein he says kick the ladder away. I think it's very important for Mr. Wittgenstein that he is not saying that the things that you cannot speak of do not exist, but he is saying, they are things you witness. He gets into a lot of Master Eckhart, apathetic, and different things like that. And so that's kind of the brilliance of Wittgenstein. Well, that shows where he was a brilliant thinker, because he understood that just because you cannot speak of it does not mean it does not necessarily exist. And this actually is pointing to a lot of what we've been getting at on the apathetic subject, the negativity and different things like that. Dimitri also asked, if we talk about the A/B, what is the slash? Well, what's interesting, that seems to be the human. You brought that up, Dimitri, on where the human being seems to be this capital C cause that is unifying things that are not together, but not unifying them in a manner that makes them no longer distinct, but brings them together precisely so that there's a tension that then becomes the compelling force. But then what's critical, we talked about the dialectic, is Hegel is also, since he's bringing forth, and then I'll give it to whoever wants to speak, bringing forth an onto-epistemology, Hegel also wants to suggest that things in themselves have this tension, that things in themselves are trying to be complete, but in that very after unveils their inability to be incomplete, and that drives them through time into ever and ever transformations. And that therefore, if we want to think well, we have to think in concordance with that dialectical ontological reality that is very difficult to think, because the human brain seems to naturally fall into rigid categories, naturally fall into overreaching maps, naturally fall into singular notions that do not develop. So we have to train ourselves to work through that. And then that would mean that one of the things we have to do is to think about, say, the sciences not being rigidly separated, not the art rigidly separated, because that right there, the moment you start saying, well, no, physics, biology, and chemistry are on the same gradient, well, that's inherently tense, because there's clearly some point in which chemistry, to use Mr. Bard's language, chemistry emerges into a biology that no longer acts like chemistry. That's really weird. How the heck does that work? Clearly, the Picasso painting on the wall is not the same as the Metaphysics of Morals by Mr. Kant. So where did the transformation occur, and where does one end and where does one begin? So that automatically creates a tension. That's why it's interesting to think of, even if we say there is not distinctions, we cannot say that there is equality, only equivalence, only likeness, only analogy. And that's, I think, does set you up for having to engage in more Hegelian ways of thinking.
Yeah, I just want to come in here because I mean, the lectures on logic, they're so full of gems. It's insane. He says that nothing can be in contradiction with itself. That is a fundamental law of thought. And then later on he says, nothing contradicts itself is a poor excuse for a law of logic. So I think this is extremely interesting because, there is something fundamental to abstract self-identity, to saying A equals A. You cannot really live if you don't take this for granted. But it feels for being a law of logic, which of course, a lot of people would say, well, then you go beyond logic. Well, this is the end of logic, is that A equals A. This is how things work, right? But when you say that something that is finite is the apple or whatever, that already contains a contradiction, because in its notional development, or through time, if you want to say it that way, it negates itself. And therefore the apple is not the apple anymore. Like Hegel says in the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit, he says, something cannot lose its truth by being written down. And I think actually Hegel does have presuppositions, For example, like how he never really substantiates this claim in the Phenomenology of Spirit. He kind of takes it for granted. But I think the better point, the philosophical point that we can conclude from that is that Hegel basically, he writes the Science of Logic, and he has two presuppositions. The first presupposition is that God exists, God is. The second presupposition is that since I'm doing philosophy, I presuppose that I can think, that I can comprehend and think the absolute. Where Nietzsche and Hegel diverge is in this second presupposition, because Nietzsche critiques this in Also sprach Zarathustra. He says, all those guys who want to think everything, they just want to make everything thinkable. And he critiques this. So yeah, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this, because, in our circles right now, we're working also on the Nietzsche anthology. And also, where Nietzsche and Hegel align, and there's many points on which they align. I'm myself researching shame in Nietzsche and Hegel right now, and it's crazy. I'm really surprising myself what I'm finding. But yeah, what do you guys think about this divergence of Hegel and Nietzsche?
I'll add just very quickly to that a few things. One, and then I'll give it to Javier. There's a question on when we say something of everydayness is art and pull it out, does that turn it into an A and it's A that kills it? And yet it would seem to be that the very reason we turn it into and say this is art, like the weaving that Bethany was saying at the beginning, is precisely to honor it and better understand it. So it almost seems to be some ways a necessary act, so that we really kind of grasp the whole of it and really care to look at it. But in that same act, there's a kind of tragedy that can occur, because then it's pulled out of the everyday life and may actually lose some of the beauty. So it's interesting to think of the relation of art and everydayness as perhaps being similar to the relation between categories and phenomenon, or categories and the terrain, where we seem to need categories, and yet the moment we do that, there's a big risk. And how does one, and then I kind of think sometimes between the A is A logic of Aristotle and the AB logic of Hegel as kind of similar to Newton and Einstein. And, you know, Newton's physics, they work like 98% of the time. They're like really great, right? You don't really need Einstein stuff. But then there's this little problem, this one little problem here that Einstein pokes at. And it turns out, oh crap, that opens up all of general relativity. And then you get quantums. And then that just opens up. And now we have all the giant debates that then gets us even to Bergson and Whitehead and different things like that. But the funny thing is that, you know, most of us still actually basically live in a Newtonian universe, like phenomenological, like in everyday life, we live generally following more so Newton than other physical theories, especially when you start getting into like, you know, M theory or whatever. Well, similarly, A is basically what we do operate according to. It would seem as if you basically must believe that that apple is in fact an apple. Otherwise, you'd be so paralyzed before it that you'd struggle to use it. And yet what Hegel finds out is once you bring time into account, once you sort of go, well, wait, phenomena don't stay themselves as a self-relating kind of constant. Oh, well, then there's a gap between the subject and the world. Oh, crap. We have to use a logic that can't possibly correspond with phenomenon in themselves in order to understand those things. So there's a big tragedy right there. In the same way that if we need the categories of art to really appreciate everydayness, there's a tragedy there because that brings with it a risk of pulling the basket weaving out of its everydayness where the full beauty of the dance of everyday life is experienced. So to me, it gets into the question of if we think of philosophy also as running this risk of ruining the everydayness, of pulling things out to understand them but not returning them. The question becomes, how does one engage in philosophy? How does one engage in art? How does one engage in more complicated onto-epistemologies without losing the ability to then integrate back into everyday life? And as we've also been talking about, it does seem as if philosophy, you know, following a David Hume or different people, it does seem philosophy is important precisely because there are forces trying to capture you. There are Black Mirror episodes trying to suck you in. There are Kafka stories that are trying to get you. So it seems as if one has to engage in these ways of thinking to avoid that capture. But the moment you do, you are pulled out of the flow of life in which the dancing and the beauty can be found. And it makes me think when you mentioned Nietzsche, and then I'll give it to Javier, where at the very end of The Gay Science, he's writing this book and then he talks about like his books, like speaking to him going, get up from the desk. What are you doing? You know, the field is now he talks it like a black and bleak question mark. And he's like, stop, right, get up and dance. It's there. It's now. The field is here. Go and play. And yet it seems very difficult to not be, say, a Nietzsche, and then to be able afterwards to go back and say, be a dancing star, to use that famous language. And yet that seems to be part of the tension. So I'll give it to Javier and then Bethany.
To address some of Dimitri's questions, at least try, right? Let's try to think it. So the idea of like this making everything thinkable, why is that? Why do we have that tendency? Like I'm going to raise the same question about why is that a concern for us? And that's what I'm trying to get at. When we want to make everything thinkable, what is that desire? The only thing that I can pinpoint in my current understanding is that we desire for relation, so therefore we try to make everything thinkable, right? We have this yearning for relation, but we think that making everything thinkable is what will get us that ultimate relation. But what you end up happening is that when you try to, you know, just to kind of like bring a very mundane example, right? Like two like flirty lovers, right? Like, oh, I'm thinking about you, like, you know, this, this thinking about you, right? Generally has the feeling is a very ambiguous thing. But when you're thinking about a person, you have a tendency to reduce them to whatever you're thinking of, whether that be a quality, whether that be a certain thing they did or they didn't do, or a specific category. We have a tendency to reduce them to that thing. So I think that's always the fear, right? When you try to think God, you have a tendency to make him into an object. And when you have a tendency to make them into objects, you have a tendency to make God the destructive force because God is now an object. And I think this goes back to the apophatic nature of the subject, which makes it so dangerous, right? Because I always think it's interesting that we as subjects say God is apophatic, like, oh, we can't know. Well, I think this problem manifests itself like kind of like the way Dimitri was putting it, with the subject having this in-betweenness, right? I think that's very funny, right? Like Daniel brought up like the gap between us and the world, right? But actually, that's interesting because it's more like my in-betweenness is that gap. But the thing is, I don't acknowledge that I have this in-betweenness, so therefore it's my sort of like false self, then this gap, and then the world. But if we all know this, right? Even Freud, in his theory of dreams, he says that those blank spaces within the dream where you're like, oh, yeah, there's just like this scene, and then there's like darkness, and then there's another scene, right? He says that darkness is a part of the dream. He says like that's not a gap. That is actually a part of the dream itself, which is very fascinating. So I think it's interesting that we have the tendency to be like, oh yeah, there's this gap. But I think it really shows that the in-betweenness is really happening. Even the idea that we encounter contradictions really emphasizes the fact that we are in-betweenness. We do have this in-betweenness because it's like, my cat doesn't, can it think contradiction? Can it think contradiction? Like, does it actually see contradiction and witness contradiction? Like, it's only when I encounter contradiction that I am in like a crisis, But that's because it has to be like this in-betweenness where I'm like, if I don't acknowledge this in-betweenness, then I'm in a crisis. So I do agree with Cadell's notion that we do need more crisis or in our life, but again, at the same time, we can't like create the crisis. We have to sort of just be, I think the best way to put this is to be sort of like a kenotic subject where we do this kenosis where we give ourselves up to the crisis. I think most horrible responses to the crisis is that we don't want to give ourselves up to the crisis. And that's typically the issue. And then to go back to, what was it? I think Daniel said something here. Because I'm very critical about like the philosophy thing. Yeah, perfect example, right? The stupid trolley problem. That's such an abstract problem that's never going to exist, like ever, right? But what's a real daily life problem is whether I should cross the road with a group of students or cross by myself. Because I encounter this problem every day I go to class. Like, there's these cars waiting, and everybody's like kind of like looking at each other, shuffling back and forth, like they don't know where to go. And then finally some girl just yells, just go, it's not your fault these drivers are horrible. It's like, so that's a very interesting dynamic, but I think that is a real philosophical situation right there. Yeah, I think that's it.
I just wanted to, I was going to bring up or make a point about like post-structuralism and like reality becoming soup, but before I get to that, I want to ask about or throw this out there about like distinguishing thinking and attention, because when we're bringing up like thinking about God and then like objectifying God into some like contradictory something, what is the difference between that and like Simone Weil when she talks about attention and giving attention, and she talks about attention as being like the highest form of like love and care. And I just want to, I'm green to a lot of well, I am super not well versed in Hegel and like this whole like subject object relationship in a Hegelian sense. And so, but like what I am relating to this discussion is like some context from Simone Weil. Like I just want to know what people think about, and whether it's just like semantics or like what's the distinction between thinking and attention giving, and what does attention bring to bear on the subject object or subject subject relationship?
I can come in here. So the distinctions Hegel makes in the lectures on logic is sense, representation, and thought. So sense is what you literally see in front of you. It's what you literally feel. The representation is if I say a rose is red and you imagine the rose. He says that, if you talk about a battle in a war, the representation of it is simpler than the actual battle that has taken place. So the word I like to use here is like it's an extraction, you extract something out of it. Now, thought is something else. It's conceptual. So if I say the rose is red, it seems very sensory, but the rose and the red, as they are in front of you, are just one thing. There is no division. Whereas when I say the rose is red, I say there is a rose, and then there is something that is red. So there's a distance between them, literally on the paper. They're connected with the is. But what is is? Well, it's being, and there's nothing sensory about being. So what Hegel is also trying to do is a good pointer is that he's trying to think what thinking is for thinking, which means that he's trying to think thinking as thinking. To break it down simply, it's like you have a notion of what thinking is and what thinking might be, and then you want to know what is the object of thinking, what is thinking in itself, truthfully, really so. Well, how do you go there? By thinking. So instead of what Aristotle did is that he just thought objects, sensory objects, the soul, the senses, everything. But what Aristotle couldn't do was to think thinking as thinking is, because thinking is a special kind of object if you take it as an object of thinking. So there's this reversal where instead of thought and objects being removed, we have the object of thought, or an objective thought. And so you collapse thought and being, and they become, what is it called, isomorphic. And this is the basic move by Hegel. I think this is basically what the absolute idea that he postulates in the Science of Logic is about. Like the two books that he basically writes are the Phenomenology of Spirit, which teaches you to become a philosopher, and then the Science of Logic, which brings you to a knowledge of the absolute idea, which is where you realize you basically become aware of what you have always already known, which is that thought and being intersect in the void, in the negativity, in the discrepancy between them. I think that's Hegel's project.
Beautifully put, Dimitri, and a few things. Javier, if you were to be on a unicycle when you get to the street, then you'd have a topic of conversation. It wouldn't be so awkward. So if you learn to ride a unicycle, that's going to work out well. Mr. Luber, great to see you, sir. Mr. Barnes, a pleasure. He has the coolest background. Dimitri, that was very good. To relate that, Ms. Tabor, on what you're asking, second section, attention, different things. If I were to put some of this in phenomenological terms, and there was a particular thinker I was thinking about, philosophical theologian, Jean-Luc Marion, who I think might be relevant for some of the topics of the apathetic subject and also this. And he wrote a very important book called God Without Being. And what he wanted to argue is where Heidegger said that, the concept of God got in the way of us thinking being. Marion turned around and says, actually, the concept of being gets in the way of us thinking about God. So he wants to think about God without being. And that actually what that means is that God is pure particularity. There's a particular term he uses. I think it's the surplus phenomenon, like a phenomenon that is so overflowing, but only in its particularity, that you can only know it in the raw encounter of it. And here's the funny thing, though. God is an abstract entity, which means to think God, you have to think God. But Marion makes the point, just very Hegelian, that thinking is always about being. Well, that's a problem, because you need thinking to think about God. But thinking is the thing of which turns God into a being. So and that's a kind of nothing, right? The exact same thing, and he makes a distinction, Ms. Tabor, to your point, because he's a big phenomenologist, I think it's between seeing and looking. And this gets into attention. And what he says is, you don't have to do anything to see. You just open your eyes and there's this infinite flood of phenomenon and colors and different things. He says, look is when in that sea of seeing, you then boom, picture, boom, bookcase. And so for him, the distinction between seeing and looking is a matter of attention, where one picks out of the sea of phenomenon something to look at. So it's deeper than, so you have seeing, which is just non-attention, don't have to do anything, it's just there. And then looking is when you draw attention to one of those phenomena. Now, here's the funny thing. So a few things. One, he points out that we don't do enough seeing because we're too quick to look. So we don't see the whole, we're always looking too quickly. But then he also points out that we have a problem when it comes to God, because that means you have to look at something invisible, because that's attention. He also says that the only way to know something is love, because love is looking and attention. So the only way you know God is love. But how do you love something that's invisible? How do you love something that you can only know through a thought of which automatically understands it in terms of being, of which it is not? And in fact, thinking of God as being ruins God, right? Okay, let's take the same thought and think about human beings. I can only see Javier's body. I can't look at Javier, right? I take a lot of Buber to be about the encounter of looking, not just mere seeing. A encounter is when you look at someone, not just see them. And what's funny about that is that means you encounter someone not in terms of being, but their radical particularity. And I think this gets a little bit into the apathetic subject, what I was thinking, that what we were talking about. Because the idea is that in order to treat it would seem as if the apathetic subject, to really get at the apathetic subject, like the name of the game is to somehow encounter Daniel without human. We were talking about the human element as apathetic. Like it's almost like the human element, or even thinking about the human, is to try to translate particularities in terms of being, which is actually then thought using Daniel or Javier or Bethany or whoever to relate to itself. You know, in the kind of Hegelian sense, like thought is trying to relate to thought to get at pure thought. But the problem is that thought is then using Daniel for its own ends of achieving a pure thought, of which is then nothing. But here's the funny thing. The only way to pay attention to someone is through thought. I have to think about Javier to try to pay him attention. And yet that very thought is then a threat to that attention, because thought is always trying to turn seeing is to looking, or an apathetic into something of being. So I am always having to use things to pay attention that make possible that attention, but also threaten to undermine that attention in the same act. So if we use Marion's thinking on this notion of, to truly believe in God, you have to believe in God without being. And actually, I think it would be to tie to Mr. Barnes' book, The Iconoclast, Marion basically argues that the effort to treat God as being turns God into a giant meta question that undermines everything. And he also, by extension, wants to say that philosophy that has not been phenomenological ends up being the autonomous rationality that Hume talks about that ends up destroying everything. And so in order to have philosophy not be this kind of force of destruction, it has to work to try to be without being, which is thought relating to thought. And yet, by definition, it must use thought to do that. So you have to have thought in order for thought to really encounter something in the Buberian sense. In order for thought to be attention and not mere thought, it has to be tragic to itself. It has to understand itself in a tragic way, as having to use being to get at things that it kind of has to be without being to really get at, which of course it can never do perfectly, but that too also can get kind of into a witnessing or kind of worshiping where you honor something you cannot fully access, because if you could fully access God, well, that's either not God or now you've turned it into an idol. And actually, it's another topic, but I'll give it to Javier and Barnes. Marion, I brought it up at the beginning. He makes very interesting distinctions in his book between idol and icon, where he talks about thought is naturally creating idols, and yet we need thought to create icons, and yet thought's very nature is to fight against creating just icons. It always wants to make an icon that is the thing that it points to, but the moment it succeeds, it creates an idol. And that's actually what we tend to do with people. We tend to very naturally start off, we say, oh, I want to pay attention to you, but then we think about them to the point and don't notice the change where we're no longer paying attention to them and thus treating them as an icon per se of Javier toward Javier. We turn them into an idol when thought then uses the person to relate to itself. And that, of course, is the point of effacement, of nothingness, because now thought is relating to thought just of itself. And yet, of course, as we learned from Hegel, we actually do need to understand thought relating to itself in order to do it well. So there's always this active skill development that's going on, but I'll pass it on to Javier and then Mr. Barnes.
Yeah, Daniel, it almost sounds like you're getting at the problem of like discernment, where we don't slow ourselves enough down in the very moment of perception to actually understand that there's a triad going on in that very, seeing. So for example, like Buddhism describes this, I think perfect, right? You have the perceived object, then you have your eyes sort of inputting the sensory to that, but that combination between the perceived object and your eyes creates what we call seeing, right? There's a Buddhist practice where you're actually just supposed to discern all those three. You're supposed to just be able to discern between the perceived object, your eyes creating that vision, and then the seeing. Like you're supposed to perceive all those three things. Until you can perceive all those three things, you're gonna have what they call, bad thinking, right? You're just gonna have, it's gonna be a wrong framework of thinking. And so they do the same thing with the contents in your mind, right? It's not just the content. You have to look at what gave rise to the content and then everything else and discern all those things. So it's actually a very critical attention that you're doing, which is important to have, because if not, then you're right. Then my thinking, my thought, I can't think thinking itself because I'm not discerning what is going on in a very critical and attentive way about how thinking is arising, how thinking is going. And then your other point, which I really love, right? This idea of, I'm always fascinated that, and this is what I like about Nietzsche, because I feel like Nietzsche, he inverts the question about, what is God, and he inverts it to like, really, what is man, right? Because I think this is such a critical point, and I almost feel like we wasted so many years trying to answer the question like, what is God, this, and this, when we as subjects are just as, like you pointed out, we're just as ambiguous as this supposed God that we're talking about, right? So if we actually take seriously the question that we were made in God's image, right? Let's just play that out, right? There is no need to ever discover who God is. If we try to discover ourselves, and then this is like a famous quote, right? Once you was it know who you are, once you know the self, you know God, something like that. If you know God, you know the self. There's that sort of dialect going on with that, but it seems like we've been having this one-sided monologue with trying to figure out what God is, and that becomes dangerous. So it almost seems like, just to bring the Nietzschean perspective in, if we are already getting captured by thoughts, then we need a practice of breaking idols. And I think Nietzsche is pretty good at this. I mean, even Buddhism has a sort of practice of like, look, if you can't discern it before it gets there and you're already captured by it, right, then you focus your attention on the capture, and the moment you start discerning that, it starts breaking apart. So it's a very critical attentive tension going on. And then to address something like Bethany's, I think with the subject, with the subject object, right? I always like Buber's kind of explanation of this, where when we look at an object, we have to try to see its otherness inside of me and that otherness inside of the object. So that way we actually, as Buber says, to see the thou in the rivers, the trees, and so on, that this is a very critical kind of like confrontation that has to be mutually determined with each other. But yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, I think everything that's been said so far is pretty interesting. I kind of wanted just to kind of take a more bird's eye view at what everyone's kind of getting at. I think what everyone's getting at here, which is all these sort of, what we're trying to do here is kind of engage intellectually, right? And it seems inevitable that whether you're doing theology, philosophy, or science, everything kind of comes back to some sort of, and this is why I think all these intellectual pursuits are ultimately not abstract things in themselves, but they're related to what we are as human beings, because they all come back to this sort of human longing for some sort of certainty and safety in a way. So I'm just sort of wondering, because the way I'm hearing it, right, is whether it's the absolute pure thought, the accelerationist outside, the subject in itself, the thing in itself, right? Or what people might have traditionally called God in theology, is that we're all trying to reach towards that certainty. And my kind of question, and I would like to get an answer on what you guys have read, because I'm really not well read on Hegel or Buber, so I'd be interested to see what you kind of pull out from them as an answer to this. What is the end game? Like, is the Hegelian end game for the dialectic to be resolved and there to be just like an absolute, in the same way that science sees the world as a set of propositional facts to be collected and then catalogued and then completed? Is that the kind of end game? Because I don't know where that end game kind of leaves us as people. I think, the continuing messiness of the world is going to stop us from getting bored. So hopefully that's a decent question for you guys.
Yeah, I can jump in here to shamelessly self-promote. Tomorrow I'm gonna do a presentation on the basics of Hegel at 8 o'clock, so I can send out the Zoom, and if we're also gonna have a discussion afterwards. So if you want to know more about that, do it. If you don't, just don't. So what is the end game with Hegel? I think that Hegel cannot just be applied to everything. Hegel thought of a method, and it's a great method, but something that's missing in Hegel is context. Context of our lives. Marx said, the context of the material conditions. So yeah, I think, Nietzsche, psychoanalysis, they are all working with kind of what the dimensions that Hegel touched, but they have also, in my view, greatly improved philosophical discourses. One more thing is that there's a difference for Hegel, a very crucial difference between dialectical and speculative. Hegel doesn't call himself a dialectical philosopher. He doesn't say, those who will follow in my footsteps are dialectical philosophers. No, he wants to do authentic speculative philosophy. And this, he basically wants to resolve contradictions by first explicating them dialectically. He says the term history means that history is that everything that happened within history is necessary, so we can dialectically explicate the movement of that, the conceptual movement. But then we're in life and we have to act out, and like Daniel said, we can't just become paralyzed because everything is contradictory. So this is where the speculative philosophy comes in, that tries to theorize the now as best as it can, or tries to theorize the is as best as it can. And if you do that, I think that if you don't if you don't float off into thinking about the future or the past, which are both virtual abstractions actually, but try to think the now as best as you can, inclusive of everything, then you can become a great philosopher. And so to be speculative is actually to resolve contradictions by embodying them and acting them out. This is basically the main takeaway. And so I think Hegel is very practical. He says in the Phenomenology of Spirit, there's a beginning and an end, and with the act I go from the beginning to the end, but I can only know what I'm doing at the end. So there's this circular kind of thing happening, and Hegel basically responds to that with a very simple thing. He says, you just got to do it. Just do it, man. He doesn't really go into it deeply. He says, you just got to do it, because otherwise, you won't even know that the real contradiction, the self-contradiction at the heart of it, which is another thing. I don't want to talk too long, but there's this thing where you can negate too early, and that you think you've gone to the heart of the matter, and that you've, let's say, completed a thinker or completed a shape of spirit, but actually you're using this negation to not fall in the negativity. Yes, spiritual bypassing. This is a great word. Yes, this is exactly what it is. Yeah, so we have so many ways to spiritually bypass, and I think for me, Hegel is someone who helps me not to spiritually bypass in my own life when it comes down to relationships and things like this.
Well, first, and I'll pass it to Mr. Luber. Emilio, always good to see you. Few things. One, it makes me think, Dr. Nicholas was talking about how there's the resolute in Hegel, which is the idea of being resolute in face of transformation, changing, tension, and different things. And a lot of what I would say the resolution is the ability to be resolute in the fact that things change, that there's a destabilizing element. And this is very important because if you, Mr. Barnes, do not expect me to be a different person 5 years from now, if you expect me all to be the same, then when you encounter me having changed, it will be difficult to be resolute in face of that transformation and maintain the relationship. You may, in fact, get upset or disparate or never talk again. So there's something about having Mr. Luber and I actually had a conversation, then I'll pass it to him, on how philosophy provides clearings in which to meet people, where we share a similar space. You know, if we all read Hegel and we expect transformation and contradiction to be part of life, then we can live in the same world, the same clearing, where we expect that, and therefore can meet each other in terms of that philosophy. And that's a good thing. And that, I think, would also get into how philosophy, by creating that clearing, can help us have attention for one another, to actually encounter, in the Bubian sense, one another. And I will also note, Mr. Barnes, I think it's important to note starting position. And me not being very Rousseauian, I would say that we naturally don't pay attention to people. I would say that we naturally do tend to have thought relate to thought, that we tend to believe things are our ideas of them as opposed to the actuality. That being the case, since we don't start off paying attention to other people, then we have to engage in practices of regaining that ability, or to gain that ability to give people attention. And in that sense, we could say that good philosophy, if I were to use the true philosophy in the human sense, is often thought without being, you know, if we're using that language, it's the thought without being, and thought where you're actually encountering people. Like, it's a resistance to the natural tendency to not look at people, to not encounter people. It's a resistance to the natural tendency to identify things as just being what they are, as opposed to transformation. And since we naturally start off, if you will, in our thinking, then we have to engage in practices to correct that. So I think you start to see why philosophy has an important role based on the starting point. Now, what's also interesting, though, is one of the good things I think we start off with is, as children, we are creative. We tend to have a creative intrinsic motivation that we then give up. So the funny thing is, how do we tend to do the worst of all possible things. We tend to lose that while then gaining bad philosophy, as opposed to keeping that while then training ourselves into good philosophy. We tend to do the exact reverse of what we need to do. And on that, I will pass it to Mr. Luber. And Emilio, good to see you, sir.
So just to answer some of the questions that were posed, I would say the goal, I think that what you're proposing, Samuel, is really good. I agree with the whole sentiment that you're getting at. I would say the whole goal, and like I'm taking a Heidegger position, is just to care. Like, he would say it's just to care. And what happens is you're looking at it in terms of a journey. So he's looking at a journey, he's looking at time in a different way, in order to reignite the caring element, to not just see existence, but to see what's beyond the existence, the meaning that makes it all come together for us to feel something toward it. That sensational realm that Hegel talks about. Now, I'm not a big Hegelian, but I know he likes to talk about basically science from a sensational standpoint, is what I gather. So I think if you ask the question in a certain way, you're automatically going to get nihilism. So for me, when I look at philosophy in a certain lens, and like especially like an existential lens, it really feels like storytelling. It feels something that's not quite philosophy in the traditional sense, because you're applying it to your own finitude. So to me, this ties in with like how Heidegger understands like the difference between religion and philosophy. And the only real difference is that religion has no being in it. Like, to think of God, he would either say is a distortion of being, or you're thinking without being. And basically, when you think about your life in the existential realm, you're automatically thinking in terms of being, because you're thinking, because you're arriving to a thought constantly. Let it be your thought or someone else's thought, you're always going to a thought in some sense. So if you look at it from like an ontological lens and not necessarily an existential lens, philosophy seems necessary in the sense that it's working with the gray, so to speak. It's trying to make something into not philosophy. So the second it becomes concrete in a sense, it becomes not philosophy. It becomes a science. So that would be kind of like my knee-jerk response to that. And then just to talk about what Bethany was saying with just the subject object, like there's so many different kind of perspectives of what that is. I just because I love Heidegger, the Heideggerian perspective is there is no subject object. It's basically to me it's Aristotelian in the sense that it's like being qua being. It's just being. It's he would just say it's like the distinctions are like between not understanding, like the reason why people say an object versus subject and not being versus being is just seeing them as a different, completely different entity in some way, shape, or form, and not looking at it from a how do they need each other perspective. I would say that's like a crude way of Heidegger's claim in that conversation. And I'll pass it off to someone else.
Yeah, I'll address Barnes' question on Buber's endgame. I mean, it's very, very close to what Dimitri had said, except Buber would put it like this, right? Like, just to kind of like reemphasize how, first of all, philosophers like Buber, Nishida, it's always so funny like reading their language because it gets really abstract, right? Just to hear at the end of the day that it's about love. Like it's like this. I'm always like so shocked about this, right? It's like it's about love, right? That's at the end of the day, they do this complex lexicon of language, and it's like, yeah, actually, how do you actually meet people? Well, it's about love. And so Buber, I mean, Buber isn't necessarily concerned about certainty. He's concerned about that we don't have true relations anymore. That's like the real problem. So, for example, if I keep myself in this self-negating loophole where I keep thinking about thinking, my problem is that I can't even connect with the guy at Walmart, right? So if I can't connect, and Samuel is laughing because I've told him this so many times. The guy at Walmart is like my concrete, like bring down to earth example. Like if the guy at Walmart doesn't really care about what you're saying, then what are you doing? But in some ways, I actually really want the guy at Walmart to not care what I'm saying because it actually brings me back to common life, right? I want somebody to tell me that they don't give two craps about what I'm saying. And that's like the whole irony of the thing, right? Like I'm thinking about thinking, and then in that very moment, I really meet thinking about this guy at Walmart. But yeah, so it seems like for Buber, his obsession is with relation. How do we have a true relation? And I think and I think even Andrew Luber addressed this because Heidegger tries to get at this too. Now we all may disagree about how human relations are supposed to be. I think that's fine. You'll find this disagreement with Buber, Hegel, Nishida, Heidegger. Like they all seem to deeply care about some type of embodied relation, some type of getting at the real concreteness of reality. But it seems like, and this is the irony, it seems like all their philosophies have to fail in some way to show that this is the concrete. And it almost seems like concrete has to fail so that way it can continue to be concrete for us. and this is why it's like, when you have a relationship with anybody, a friend or a lover, you don't want to know everything about them. In fact, I hope that I continue to never know about all of them, right? So it keeps us engaged in dialogue. I'm always concerned, like when I encounter a woman, she's like, okay, well, I just want to know everything about you. I'm like, okay, well, this is gonna fail. Like this is immediately gonna fail. Like I don't know what you're trying to do. Like I think you're trying to like gaslight yourself somehow. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it there.
Hello, everyone. Um, just some quick thoughts. The first thing that stood out to me, maybe I'm using the terminology wrong, but the when I think it was Andrew when he said that it stops being philosophy when it goes concrete, it becomes a science, and that was really interesting to me because it's like, oh, that statement makes sense, but in a way, it's like ideas in themselves are concrete, kind of, so you don't have to like reduce them to anything. And it's weird, right? Because when you're dealing with physical matter, you can make laws and physics and stuff, but when you're talking about ideas, it becomes like much more flimsy, right? It becomes harder to grasp. And this leads me to the second point, that is, the as Javier just said that when you're thinking about thinking, it's just like, that's hell. That's you're just so removed from reality. And that rang true in my heart, because recently I've been waging a war on ideas, like, because most people most people like say that reading books is a good use of time, right? Like, oh, reading books is good, but I would argue that maybe not, right? Because if reading the book is a trade-off of actually living life, you can either read a book, or you can go actually have a physical experience in life. You can go skateboard, you can go talk with someone. And of course, books are useful and ideas are useful. Like we could not have this conversation even when you're saying that ideas, like, you wage a war on ideas, you use words and you use ideas to declare that. So it's not that like you can escape it, and they are useful in the sense, the paper that for me captured it the best was when it's the one that says that ideas are practically ice by O.G. Rose. That for me, it's like the, yeah, it's like the center of it, because for me it it represented in the most like beautiful way that, yeah, like the thing with the box, like, ideas don't help you move the box, but they shape the way you understand reality, and that in turns affects how you view the box in a really practical, tangible sense. But so maybe it's a crude distinction, but there are some books that you read them and then you go back to reality, and you engage more deeply with reality, with life, and that's good and that's cool. But sometimes you read a book and then you're saying like, oh, what does this mean? And then it's purely in the realm of ideas, and I'm just and yeah, and I've been consuming a lot of words, a lot of text, a lot of reading, and I just became like sick of it. That's like why I brought my skateboard to here to my well, to my school, so I could just like, instead of reading, I'm just like skateboarding around. And it's been better. And it's weird because in some way it's contra-intuitive, because like I've always liked to read, and people are always like, oh, that's such a good habit to have, and I'm like, oh, thank you, yeah, that's fine, that's good. But the recently I'm starting like maybe reading book, it's not that great a habit. Parentheses, of course, like being like, but yeah. So precisely, return to the Walmart. Return to Walmart is there are some ideas that lets you connect with the Walmart person. Maybe it is love, as you guys were saying. Maybe it all comes down to it. But yeah, so right now I'm thinking about all this, and yeah, so that's been fun, raging a war with ideas in my heart. So yeah, but anyway, thank you.
Well, Emilio, thank you. I appreciate the reference. And the key to that title, too, is ideas are practically eyes. Like, in practice, they are eyes. Like, if we're sitting down and having ideas relate to ideas, then they are not eyes. And there seems to be a distinction between that. So, Emilio, I can't skateboard, so I salute you. And I'm going to pass it here to Dimitri and Mr. Barnes. And as we come up on the end here, if anyone has anything left to say, alas, I will have to, I have to go, not super strictly, so please go through. We're finally, Mr. Barnes could tell, we were going to take Barnes when he was here to a corn maze at a place called Yoder's, and they were not open, but they are open today. day. So, Mr. Barnes, you will be there in spirit when we get lost and when we eat our funnel cake. So, Mr. Barnes, we're going today in honor of you. We're so sad that they would close that day. But please, I'm going to give it to Dimitri's and Mr. Barnes, and then whoever else would like to speak as we come to the close here.
Matthew 18:2. He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Hegel uses this quote in the Encyclopedia and the Philosophy of Spirit to argue the point that there is a childlike innocence that is attractive and touching, but insofar as we would like to be like this and become like this, this has to be brought about by spirit. So we have to relinquish our natural animalistic child, go through the camel and the lion, and become the spiritual child. That was the end game of Nietzsche, I believe, the three metamorphoses of spirit and this child. So I just wanted to bring that out here because Daniel, you have children, and you also talked about children in just now, and I thought it was very interesting what you said. Andrew, I have a question for you, because you said that this notion of Heidegger of being qua being is very Aristotelian. Now, always when I hear Heidegger and that we forgot being, I think about Plato, because Plato had this idea of recollection, that the perfect forms to come to know them is a recollection. So to say that we forgot being implies maybe that, oh, okay, so let's remember being, right? And this, to me, it seems like a Platonist thing. So I wonder how you think about that, and if you could go deeper into your ideas about this and Heidegger. Since I don't know anything about Heidegger, I'm very ignorant.
That's a good question. So I would just say that, well, first, I kind of want to go a little beyond Heidegger, in the sense that my take from reading Heidegger's take of Plato and the sentiment of recalling being is, I think, the entire allegory of the cave, for example. To me, there really is no cave and outside. It's all one place. And I think that's like, I'm echoing something that Heidegger says in terms of him focusing on being with a capital B and it being a one thing and it being non-circular at the same time, which sounds a little confusing, because it definitely is confusing. But just to clarify the question a little bit, just so I can think about like what Heidegger would say in terms of Plato recalling being in what sense? In terms of the cave, like in terms of like in general, like what's the question?
In terms of, so Plato is influenced by Parmenides, and for Parmenides, change is an illusion, and stasis, the stasis of the perfect forms are the truth. So Hegel looked around him in the world and he saw the flux of appearances and was like, okay, but let me pinpoint the finite conceptual forms which my soul can get at. And this is like Plato himself called this a recollection. It's a gesture of recollection. So, I in the net one time I was talking about, if you're doing maths, are you discovering the formulas or are you creating the formulas? A Platonist answer would be that you're discovering the formulas. So that means you're tapping into some otherworldly realm, as Nietzsche would put it. So this is like where the recollection is. And I mean, I think this is, I have thoughts about this in regards to Hegel, but I want to stay just, is my question clear?
Yes, your question's clear. I thought I lost connection for a second. My fault. I'm on like a construction site, so I'm trying to walk away from all this noise. Basically, Heidegger would say that in terms of the recollection aspect. It is the lost and found concept that Heidegger would probably, it's most relatable. You go from an inauthentic state to an authentic state, you find yourself and you lose yourself again. And basically it's like you keep discovering. So to answer like that dichotomy, he would probably say discover. You're discovering a new world as your time continues. I would say he sees things more on like a continuum a bit more. I think Heidegger would say that when people go from the abstract to the concrete, to kind of use Hegelian terms, what's happening is they're going from inauthentic Dasein to authentic Dasein. And I think it replicates that like movement in thinking and in action, in the sense that when I mean by philosophy going from philosophy to something concrete as a science, to Heidegger, the foundation of all science is in Dasein. The foundation of being for us is in Dasein. So he would basically say that when we are not in touch with Dasein is when we're lost. We're in an inauthentic state. And when we're in touch with Dasein is when we're in off. That it kind of captures the Hegelian, like in my mind, going from something concrete to like just pure thinking. But it has a more tangible existential attribute in it, in the sense that it feels like it pertains to an action and not just like a theoretical action. So it's a little tricky to talk about because there's a huge difference in my opinion, a huge difference in thinking when you go from just talking about theoretical action to action itself. If that makes sense.
Well, thank you, Ms. Luber. And I like that distinction between authentic and inauthentic Dasein. If anyone else has anything to say, please speak. And you're walking through a construction site, you might hear a lawnmower. You know, a few things. One, if I were to use simple language, we could say that Marion is saying that we need to think of God without lowercase b being so that we can get capital B being. And it just turns out to be the case that capital B being is much closer to concrete particularity than abstract universal. And so it's almost better to talk about God as a he uses it like a super saturated phenomenon. And it kind of makes sense because if you look at the bookcase, I never actually encounter every detail of a phenomenon. He kind of points out that like everything is just overflowing with details and colors and different possible experiences that we never fully capture. And so he just says, you know, take God and times that by 1,000,000. And basically what we're suggesting is that human beings themselves, Daniel, as opposed to the body of Daniel, Mr. Barnes, good to see you, sir, is likewise more so a super saturated phenomenon than some sort of abstract universal. And it seems and the problem though is that thinking naturally understands and seems to have to understand according to lowercase b being, a sort of reductionist action. And then the funny thing is you require that lowercase b being in order to have any possibility of paying attention to capital B being. So you right there have a significant problem. And how does one work that out in different things like that? A few more things. We seem to be discussing a lot of the ethics of philosophy itself. Ethics being the right way to act, the right way to carry yourself. So what is the ethics of philosophy itself? Not say the ethics of missile defense systems, the ethics of relationships, but the ethics of philosophy. And that, like, what does one use philosophy for? And I think understanding one's starting positions is quite important. So for example, very often I think when we ask this question, are we better with philosophy or not? The image we have in mind is the difference between someone who's reading a lot of books, reading a lot of Hegel or whatever, and someone who's able to go and play in a park somewhere, You know, those are kind of the differences we have in our mind. It's like, am I really, and then you go, okay, am I really better to be, you know, reading Hegel as opposed to being outside, taking a walk and enjoying common life? I would submit to you that that's not actually the choice, and that the brain kind of pulls a fast one on you. The choice is between studying philosophy or ending up in Nazi Germany, ending up in a mob, ending up in a crowd, ending up brainwashed. That is not so simple between, say, philosophy or getting to play in the park. It's a choice between philosophy or playing in the park and having no defenses against, say, the zeitgeist of the age, what Ayn Rand called the secondhand smoke of the ideas of today, of which pull you in to a mass movement, popularism, some of the kind of extremisms we have. So the first thing I think is important when we ask the questions of ethics of philosophy, we kind of get out of our head a Rousseauian thought experiment where we think the choice is between reading books or having fun in the park, when really the choice is between, say, thinking about these stuff or being vulnerable. And basically, in all probability, if you're vulnerable, it's only a matter of time before you get swept up and controlled by the algorithms into a populist movement. So I think that helps balance. At the same time, philosophy that does not ultimately help you be a man, to use the language of Hume that Mr. Barnes uses, or help you play with your kids, or helps you get into the concrete, is problematic. Well, if indeed to have a common life that is safe and secure and that we actually experience the full wonder of, we have to go through philosophy, that means we have to take a risk in order to live a life, in a sense, without philosophy, because it merges into the background, to describe the tarot card that Bethany was describing. In the same way that it's almost as if we have to see things in terms of art that necessarily threatens the fabric of the everydayness it is part of in order to protect it so that people don't come along and get rid of it. But the moment we call it art, we may pull it out of the stream of everyday life that makes it beautiful, as opposed to just exhibitions in a museum. So it seems to be human is to deal with risk, that there's no possibility of avoiding risk. And the questions become, what is the ethics of that risk? What is the right way to live in accordance with that risk? I would submit the following. We've talked, and then sadly I'll have to go. If anyone else has anything else to say, please raise your hands. We mentioned 2 net sessions ago, this kind of idea of a locked door, that there were all these myths in the past about there being some tree you can't eat the fruit off of, some box you cannot open, something that some veil you cannot go across. And if you tear it down, it has terrible consequences and different things like that. I would also submit to you, and then I'll give it to Javier. I would submit to you that if I'm going to use the mythos of the Garden of Eden, I would submit to you that there actually was philosophy in the Garden of Eden, because Adam was able to look into the animals and name them. And in Judaism, naming an animal means you're able to tap into their very essence. And that means if philosophy is somehow getting to the things of what they are as supersaturated phenomenon, then Adam was actually able to do that. Also, St. Augustine tells us that Adam and Eve, and actually just Adam at the time, because there's a Trinitarian structure, it's not Adam and Eve until after the fall. Augustine tells us they were children. And so you have children that are engaging in a kind of good philosophy, and that this is the defining, and there's also a kind of work. This also goes to show that the hard distinction between work and play we need to work with, because there's a kind of labor that's going on in the garden. That's good. So there's a good work, there's a good philosophy, and there's something childlike about Adam. Well, then they eat from the tree, which is actually, in a funny way, philosophy trying to know that it is philosophy, as opposed to trusting that it is philosophy. It is knowledge trying to know itself as knowledge, as opposed to just living in the everyday as knowledge. It is art that we've pulled out from the everyday, as opposed to art we've integrated into the everyday that is beautiful. And the same goes with thought that is no longer part of living in the garden, but is trying to think about the garden. It would seem as if the name of the game, in a funny sense, is to have a kind of one could say the end of the Humean journey, the re-achieving of a good philosophy, is a sense to return to the Garden of Eden, see ourselves as children, and this time not to eat from the tree, this time not to open Pandora's box. And that it's almost like you could see human history as a second chance at these myths, of which has to go through history in order to experience the consequences of not knowing what happens when you eat from this tree, or when you try to know the meta question, as Mr. Barnes puts it, or when you don't leave Pandora's box closed. And one goes through history to see what occurs when philosophy overreaches, to have a second chance, where this time you know that the tree has to be there because there has to be risk. We've been saying this. There must be risk. If there's no risk, there seems to be some problems that happen. And also it would seem that risk is part of freedom. But this time, one does not give into that temptation. So we can see that what the name of the game of philosophy seems to be now is a kind of return to a state where there is something you leave untouched precisely because it is necessary for there to be the terrain in which you are alive at in your fullness as children and engaged in good philosophy, and you leave it alone. And you know that leaving it alone is a good thing, because if you knew everything, you'd be miserable. This was mentioned in the comments. If you knew everything about a girl, there's no mystery, right? There's no curiosity. Curiosity and unknown is a necessary element of the human experience so that they care to be alive, so that there's motivation, so that there's interest in different things. There's a fantastic, and then I'll close and pass it to Javier. It's a fantastic book. It won the Nobel Prize in Literature, and then nobody proceeded to read it for a long time. It's a book called The Bridge Over the Drina by Avo Andrić. It's a tremendous book. And there's a scene in it with the woman Fatima, beautiful woman. Everyone wants to get in bed with her. Everyone wants to sleep with her and blah, blah, blah. And she's kind of forced into a marriage and eventually commits suicide and jumps off the side of this bridge. And her clothes get ripped off in the river. And they can see her naked now, just like all these lusting drunk men want. And they don't want to see her at all. It's like horrifying to them. There's a scene where they blow the smoke away. Because now that there's no life in this body, it's not, the beauty is gone. That there was something about the veil that it's no longer, the body is no longer a veil once it is dead. It's no longer hiding anything. And that hidden component is what is part of the desire. If it is no longer there, you don't want it. And then, of course, they're all blowing, pushing the smoke away because they're so horrified by the realization that what they want is something of which they cannot access. And when it's not there, they don't want it anymore. And that seems to have something to do with the structure of human desire. And so likewise, it would seem philosophy, in order to be good philosophy, as opposed to deconstructive, self-effacing philosophy, must be one that operates according to a mythos that honors Fatima, that understands the necessity of the veil, and that understands the necessity of a tree of knowledge that one does not eat the fruit from. If philosophy does not do this, it tends to turn into a self-relating effacement, and instead of a humbling practice that helps one be more concrete. I think our challenge today is to figure out and to actually live according to and experience a philosophy that operates according to that mythos, as opposed to a philosophy of which tries to eat from the tree. Javier.
My favorite story of the fall is always when God goes, "Wait, how do you know that you're naked?" That's always like my favorite point, Adam and Eve start freaking out, and God's like, "Wait a second, how do you know that you're naked?" You know that you're naked? It's a very it reminds me a lot like children, right? Children like running around naked. And yet, as parents, we're like, whoa, 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 like we're very cognizant of their nakedness. We try to prevent them from, running around naked in public and so on. But the house, do what you want. But it's with the child and this, kind of like spiritual child that Dimitri was talking about, where the child seems to draw no boundaries between his nakedness and the world. But we as adults, we clearly see the boundaries between our own nakedness and the world. And you can really see this in Adam and Eve. It's almost like Satan, proposing the apple. It's actually the proposal of the abstraction, where it was like the moment we accepted the abstraction, we realized we were naked. And so that sort of begins the fall. But I have a couple of questions in the sense of, so yeah, I agree with you on the, I think there is like a false choice going on with like, okay, so we just need to read philosophy or we just need to just be out there in the world. I guess like for the skeptic, because I'm, ever since I hung out with Barnes, now it's like I get like the Barnes skeptic in my head now. So okay, so how do we manifest this notion of keeping a thing, keeping a thing forbidden in like a sort of ordinary life? And I think actually Adam Phillips writes a really good book on this, about our obsession with the forbidden. Like there's something about categorizing it, labeling it as forbidden, that makes us want to engage with it. Whereas for some reason, our attention never focuses on the unforbidden, right? There is no cherishing of the unforbidden, right? And I think this is really a good example of like common life, because, for some reason we all have this arbitrary division within our own life, right? Like, this is my work life, this is my personal life, oh, and this is my religious life. Like we always have these like very arbitrary divisions, but at the same time they always interpenetrate each other like all the time. And so, oh, bye, Bethany. But yeah, it just I'm having, I guess, a hard time like seeing how, because I think I remember I asked you before. I said, okay, if somebody doesn't read Hegel, right, how are they supposed to, deal with reality and so on? And you said, well, it's not that they need to read Hegel; they just need to have like the skills of Hegel, which manifests a type of praxis. But again, my question is like, okay, so how does the guy at Walmart manifest a type of praxis that he is doing something to what Hegel is doing without having read Hegel, right? How does he constructing a type of praxis that he understands that whatever is going on is some type of dialectical contradiction, which manifests itself and so on. So I guess that'd be like my question, like how does this manifest in sort of the praxis? Do we need religion in this case? Do we need to relook religion in this case? Because it does seem like philosophy's problem is always coming up with a type of praxis, whereas religion, now they already have established praxis. The problem with religion is they haven't, their theological dogmas can be faulty. Right, which is why we need theology in the first place, because that means you're always refining the arguments, right? So can
I just
yeah.
sorry, can I just jump in real quick to answer your
Ahead.
question, which leads perfectly into the thought that I just want to clarify that I said earlier, is stories. Like, people are philosophizing one way or the other. They are telling themselves there's some dialogue that they're having no matter what. And like that's what I mean by like there is no cave. There is no distinction. There's always a dialogue of some sort. And the real primordial question isn't the cave analogy. Like, to me, when you get caught up in the cave analogy, you're missing the point. You're not starting from the correct starting point, and that to me is a Heideggerian move. But to me, it's like, to say beyond Heidegger, it's like, to me, there is no such thing as really beyond Heidegger in a sense. Just like there is no beyond any philosopher, but like in a certain sense, the world's different, and like I feel like what we're talking about and what a lot of people get at are a lot of the times beyond Hegel, beyond these thinkers, just because the world is different. And like what they're talking about is in the same line of thinking as them, but it's just attacking the content differently because the content itself is a little different.
That's actually perfect, Mr. Luber. And then there is no such thing as a person not doing philosophy. In the same way that there's no such thing as a person who doesn't have health. Does a person at your grocery store go to the gym? And maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't have time, or he's tired at the end of the day. No one would sit around and say, oh, well, then health doesn't apply to him. You will have the consequences of not going to the gym, even if you have really, really, really good reason for not going to the gym. You will have the consequences of, say, maybe you eat a lot of unhealthy food because you cannot afford organic food. Doesn't matter. The consequences are still there. And so we always have to remember that philosophy is exactly what Mr. Luber said. Philosophy is not, none of us here is enlightened. None of us have a map that equals the territory, right? None of us here, is perfect, because what does that word even mean in thought when you're dealing with something that is fundamentally and essentially destined to fail? There is no perfect thought, because we've been saying this whole time that thought always has to fail to fully capture the object, right? So what we're simply saying is that the question is there a return on investment that is worth the effort of, say, reading Hegel or reading Hume, of which is greater than just being the person at the grocery store who lives the story or philosophy that they're always already in, who doesn't do that time? Is there a return on investment that is worth it? Well, I think it depends on the philosophy. That's why it's very important to say, for me, it's very important that philosophy increases your ability to see wonder in the world. It increases your ability not to end up in conflict, that it doesn't get you up in drama, that it keeps you from getting sucked into fascism or banality of evil, that it helps you have intrinsic motivation. There are a lot of benefits to philosophy, but in the same way that there is no, say, some people need to do a lot of cardio. Some people need to do a lot of weightlifting. It depends on the person, on the kind of exercise they need to do. And there's not a single exercise you can do. Some people don't need to read Hegel, but they do need to read maybe Hume, or maybe they need to read the Bible because you brought up religion. Basically, the notion, so it depends on, who you are, what you need to do, what you need to read, so on and so on and so on. Religions basically seem to have thought that every single person on, let's say Christianity at least, that everyone from the blacksmith to the, to the college professor needed some kind of teaching every Sunday, some kind of sermon, some sort of giving of ideas that would also have to be in the context of a community of difference that was not easy to get along with necessarily. And religions were also like, hey, guy at the grocery store, we know that you don't want to take care of the poor or read the Bible, but we're going to use like ethics and moral codes to make you do it. Now, you can say that's bad because then they oppress people, but there was in religions a kind of idea that there is some sort of amount of abstract reasoning that is important for everyone to have. The question becomes the return on investment. So I think we can all agree it's better to say be a good thinker than a bad thinker. Right? There's that kind of difference. But the question is what is the return on investment between, say, good and like excellent or something, right? Maybe practically speaking, there's not that much of a big of a difference. So it's not worth doing. Maybe we should all just kind of stop with maybe reading 6 or so philosophers or whatever, and then not going from there. I actually think the answer to that question is relevant to the amount of difference, globalization, complexity that is going on in the system. Actually, that's why we talked about the meta question. I think as the meta crisis develops and you get more complex, Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. As you get more complex social dynamics and complexity, the amount of, say, philosophical reasoning or complicated thought, it does become more necessary. In the same way that when you swim on the shallow side of a swimming pool, you don't need to know how to swim as much. But when you get out in the middle of the ocean during a hurricane, your swimming abilities are going to need to be much greater. And if we think of philosophy as a kind of skill or a kind of ability, as opposed to I'm smarter than other people, a guy who knows how to, say, build a tent out in the forest in the middle of a city, who cares, right? But if you're in a situation where you're in the forest, because he has that skill, it is better to have that than not, right? So likewise, if we start thinking about philosophy in terms of skill, habits, and abilities, and we start saying we are increasingly entering into a world of complexity, of ideologies, of algorithms, Kafka episodes, and all these things, then not having those skills means that you are vulnerable, that you are susceptible. Now, is it the case that the person who is at the random grocery store is necessarily doomed because they don't have that ability or in trouble? No, not at all. In the same way that I could randomly invest in a random stock and it turns out to be GameStop, 2 years ago, and it goes to $400 a share. I don't have any training inside. I just got lucky, but lucky can practically be real. Luck can be a concrete reality of now having $10 million or something like that. So we cannot speak in terms of necessity. But if we're thinking in terms of return on investment of the likelihood of philosophical engagement, I do think that the probability of there being a bad return on investment of not engaging in philosophy increases substantially as you go into an increasingly interconnected world, as you go into globalization, automation, all these different things. And actually, I actually believe that Hegel in the philosophy of right seems to posit that philosophy arises in the movement of history precisely as more and more difference and complexity emerges interconnected and encountering one another. When you had everyone ideologically similar, say Baptist, Christian, or whatever, you didn't really need philosophy. You just needed dogma, you just needed religion, you just needed family and community. But as difference encounters, which inherently unveils the groundlessness of your ideology, it lacks an ultimate grounding, like we've been saying, well, then you have to come to terms with it and existentially stabilize yourself with it, right? And that's actually why I think psychoanalysis and philosophy end up under globalization and neoliberalism, or whatever term you want to use, increasingly come together because it has this existentially stabilizing effect that if you don't engage in, it is going to be very difficult to resist strongmen, totalitarianism, depression, mental illness, all these different things. So if we think of it that way, then we start to see what philosophy is doing. And frankly, you could just take out philosophy and just say thinking. Like, what is thinking doing? Do you need thinking? And if philosophy is simply an intense form of thinking, then as at the beginning, we were saying categories are kind of problematic, physics, chemistry, we divide these, like we do this thing where we divide philosophy from everyday thinking by calling it philosophy. But if we realize that philosophy is just everyday thinking to following it through based on, you noticed things change. That's why Hegel starts with sense experience. You notice that things change, right? Oh, you notice that your idea of something doesn't match up with what it actually is. Oh, you notice that you have a tendency to become thoughtless and get sucked into a power structure. Oh, that's not just thought relating to thought. That's based on everyday life. And so from your everyday life, you then think, what kind of being must I be to end up in those situations? And how must thinking work to deceive me into thinking that I'm thinking accurately when I am not? Like self-deception for me, like I guess if you go back to what really started me in philosophy, it was actually in the literary realities, big time in philosophy, it was the literary realities of self-deception and irony. If you take those very, very seriously, that human beings are naturally prone for irony and self-deception, well, then you better start thinking about thinking, because thinking is in the business of tricking you. And if thinking is in the business of tricking you and you have no choice but to think, that means every single day you are at risk of being tricked. Can you ignore that reality and get by? Be my guest. Emilio.
Wonderful speech or thoughts, Daniel. I agree with what you and everyone has said about like different philosophies being like useful. Like, so then the distinction I would make is that not precisely that there's and I also really like the way that philosophy is just like thinking like, but more like powerful. I really like that. So then if we make some definitions, you could say that philosophy is this thinking that is useful. And if you're thinking about thinking and you get stuck in a loop and you're like, and it becomes recursive and you're thinking about ideas and that's not helping you in any way, like maybe that can be named like with another word, or we can think about it in a different way, because I think that was my gripes with ideas, that there are so many ideas that are completely useless. And well, that's a strong statement, but let's say like that are like there's some stuff that I learned in class that the teachers have actually like they have said to me like, oh yeah, this doesn't like apply in the real world, like in like they know it doesn't work and they still teach it. So there are like a bunch of ideas, a bunch of like thought process that are not useful in any way. So I think that was my war against them, because it's just like because they poison the well of good ideas and thoughts, and it becomes like mixed and it becomes like a horrible mess. But yeah, so maybe that's the distinction I want to make. I'm waging a war on these ideas that are poisonous or are irrelevant, that don't let the good ideas, the philosophy, the thinking shine through. And yeah, so that was a beautiful speech or train of thought, Daniel. I really, really enjoyed it. And yeah, thank you.
Well, you're a beautiful soul, Emilio, and I fear I must run now for funnel cake in the corn maze at Mr. Barnes. He just left. He's like, you're going to Yoder's without me, you jerk. We tried, Barnes. We tried. They were closed. No, I think one way, if we're talking to close on this kind of myth of a return to the Garden of Eden, but this time not eating from the tree, there's a way in which eating from the tree of knowledge is to try to live on knowledge alone. Jesus said you can't live on bread alone. And at that time, it's almost like we've gone too far now, and actually you need truth or whatever. But we have to go elaborate on that. But you cannot live on knowledge alone. But it's critical to understand that in the garden, there was, in fact, deep thought, the ability to name the animals according to their essence. The Garden of Eden is not a state without philosophy. It's a state with true philosophy, following David Hume, where the tree of knowledge, of which they ate from precisely to get the philosophy they already had, is the bad philosophy, where then knowledge tries to live on knowledge and be a way of life in of itself. Now, ultimately, one cannot forget to be a man, as Hume would put it. And what that looks like is thinking precisely to live the life you're living, which means to see the wonder there, to be motivated to live the life that you are living, to have those Bubian encounters. I would argue that the encounters Buber talks about are very difficult to have without some sort of training in philosophy, right? You want your experience of the person at the shopping center to be Boolean. Well, Boolean encounters are not natural. They are not things you just tend to do. They are things that will require you to think about, but then more importantly, practice. But since you have to think about them to practice, there's the temptation of just thinking and never going to practice. In the same way, you have to have the Garden of Eden. You have to have the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden for Eden to be Eden, but that means paradise must have a risk. We tend to think that paradise is the place without risk. The revelation is that there is only a paradise where there is risk. And the question is, do we manage our risk by thinking well so that we do not fall into that risk poorly by eating from the tree, as opposed to benefiting from the risk of being in the terrain, being in the garden that it makes possible? The last thing before I forget, Mr. Javier, that you mentioned on this kind of skill in different things, this kind of lack in different things, like, for example, you were talking about forbidden and unforbidden in different things, right? You are not forbidden from touching an electric wire. It's just the case that if you touch it, you die. Are you forbidden from touching it? Or is it simply the forbidding is not really forbidding? You can do it. It's just that you will die. There's a difference between arbitrary forbidding and a parent telling a child that you can't jump in front of a car because you will die. The child is being forbidden from jumping in front of a car, but it is indivisible from the facticity of the car killing you if it hits you, right? So, but the problem is you'll find as a parent, you're actually kind of forced to use forbidding because they don't have the experience of the car hitting someone. So you find yourself in like having to use forbidding, or else they would have to experience the thing that experiencing you can never go back from. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this creates a problem because you're right. The moment you forbid, it's a forbidden fruit phenomenon, but otherwise they don't know. This is the thing. You forbid where there is ignorance, but then the very forbidding makes the thing tempting. But that is an inescapable dynamic. Do you see what I'm saying? This is the problem, and this actually might be a hint at the Garden of Eden as a mythos to structure thinking. Because basically what we are saying is that literally thinking itself requires something that it denies from itself so that thinking does not destroy itself. This is not a forbidding. This is part of the very structure of thought itself in its essence. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is not where thought has to deny itself the possibility of being the territory fully, precisely so that thought does not become a force of destruction. This is not a forbidding. This is in the functionality of it. This is why Hegel is so valuable, because Hegel gives you a reason to think that absolute knowing as limit is part of thought. It's not just someone. Hegel could have just said at the beginning of the phenomenology of spirit, he could have said, don't think too much. And that would have been forbidding. And then you would have done it and jumped in front of the car, right? So he says, well, that's not going to work. We have to go through the motions of thought to get to the place where we see the mythos, the myth of there being a limitation to thought as part of thought itself, to there being a tree of knowledge as part of the thought itself. It's not where thought is just arbitrarily forbidding itself because why not? It is forbidding itself because that thing that is off limits is necessary in order for it to function. In the same way, what Marion is saying is that you have to think of God without being, precisely so that God stays God, but that means you have to limit yourself from thinking about God according to being, of which thought naturally thinks according to. So in order to actually have a relationship with God, you have to deny yourself the ability to think God, of which, though, at the same time, you can only know God as an abstract entity by thinking about him. Therefore, there has to be a new way of thinking, and he's going to get into love as thinking, love as knowing, relations. Like you said, it always comes back to that. So Hegel wants to show that the structure of thought has an essential limit that is part of it, that without that essential limit, it's like a car that doesn't have an engine. A car without an engine cannot run. So thought without that essential limit cannot operate. And in fact, if it denies that limit, then it will destroy itself. And the closing point is this. One can think of historical development as a place where thought moves from a place where at the beginning it was forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge, and therefore it was that problem as the parent with the child I described at the beginning, to moving through history to getting to the point where they're not really forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge. They know that the tree of knowledge, that absolute knowing, is part of the functioning of thought. It is the engine to the car. So you move from it being something that you're forbidden to something that you know has to be off limits so that you can live. And that's why you have to have that historical development, so that it moves from a doctrine of forbidding to a doctrine of understanding of the essentialness of lack and absolute knowing, so that you can think and live in the garden and not eat from the tree of knowledge. And with that, I will have to go. Thank you very much for your time. You're all beautiful souls.